There comes a quiet moment in every heart when love no longer feels like light, but like a weight we have learned to carry in silence. We begin to notice the subtle absence of peace, the slow fading of mutual care, and the way our spirit bends just to keep something alive that is already slipping away. In that stillness, we are not being broken, we are being awakened, because not every ending is a failure, and not every departure is loss. Sometimes walking away is the most honest declaration of self-respect we will ever make. Today is about those moments of truth, the inner whispers we often ignore, and the courage it takes to recognize when a relationship has fulfilled its season. There is a quiet truth that often arrives without announcement, yet it changes everything. Mutual respect is the soil in which every healthy relationship must grow. Without it, even the strongest feelings begin to wither, because affection cannot survive in an environment where dignity is repeatedly overlooked. In the beginning, we may overlook small dismissals, subtle remarks, or moments where our voice is gently ignored, convincing ourselves that love will soften what respect has failed to hold. But time has a way of revealing what intention tries to hide. When respect is absent, what remains is imbalance. And imbalance, though it may be tolerated for a while, will eventually speak loudly enough for the heart to hear. Stoic wisdom reminds us that our worth is not something to be negotiated or proven through endurance. It is something to be honored through the choices we make each day. When a relationship begins to demand that you shrink yourself, silence your thoughts, or question your value just to maintain connection, it is no longer a partnership, but a quiet erosion of self. You may find yourself walking on fragile ground, measuring your words, adjusting your presence, and dimming your light so that someone else feels comfortable in your shadow. But no bond that requires the diminishing of your spirit can ever truly call itself love in its fullest sense. Respect is not only spoken, it is demonstrated in listening, in consideration, in the way two people hold space for each other's humanity. When that space disappears, conversations become battles, understanding turns into assumptions, and kindness is replaced by control or indifference. Over time, this absence does not remain neutral. It leaves behind a lingering heaviness, a sense that something essential is missing, even in moments that should feel warm. And in that absence, the heart begins to recognize a deeper need, not just to be loved, but to be valued as an equal presence, not an optional one. There comes a point when the mind and the heart must align with truth rather than habit. Staying in a place where respect is consistently lacking is not a sign of loyalty. It is often a quiet abandonment of self. Stoicism calls us to observe reality without illusion, to accept what is, rather than cling to what we wish it could be. And in that clarity, we are given the strength to choose differently, not from anger, not from resentment, but from a grounded understanding that our dignity is not dependent on another person's ability to recognize it. To honor yourself is not to turn away from love, but to refine your understanding of it. Love that is mutual, steady, and respectful will never require you to question your worth in order to feel secure within it. And when respect is absent despite your efforts to nurture it, the most courageous act is not to hold on tighter, but to step back with the quiet confidence that you deserve a connection where your presence is met with the same regard you so freely offer to others. There are relationships that do not break loudly, but slowly, quietly, through an emotional imbalance that asks one heart to carry what should have been shared. In the beginning, you may not name it as imbalance. You may call it patience, commitment, or understanding. You give a little more of yourself each time, believing that love requires sacrifice and that endurance is a noble expression of devotion. Yet over time, what once felt like giving begins to feel like draining, and what once felt like closeness begins to feel like distance you cannot quite bridge. The scales tip, not in dramatic moments, but in small, repeated experiences where your needs are softened, postponed, or forgotten altogether. In such spaces, love begins to lose its nourishment. It no longer replenishes your spirit. Instead, it asks you to return again and again to a place where your emotional energy is spent faster than it is restored. You may find yourself hoping for the version of the relationship that exists in your memories or your expectations, rather than the reality that stands before you. And in that quiet hope, you continue to invest, to explain, to forgive, and to wait, believing that balance will eventually return if you just hold on long enough. But Stoic clarity invites a deeper question. At what point does endurance become self-neglect? Emotional imbalance often reveals itself in subtle patterns. One person becomes the constant listener, the problem solver, the one who adapts, while the other remains unchanged, unresponsive, or inconsistently present. Conversations begin to revolve around one perspective, one set of needs, one emotional landscape. Over time, the heart that gives begins to feel unseen, not because it has stopped expressing itself, but because its expressions are no longer met with equal care. This lack of reciprocity creates an invisible weight, a sense that you are holding up something that was never meant to rest on your shoulders alone. Stoicism teaches that we must observe the nature of things without distortion. When a relationship consistently requires endurance rather than offering mutual nourishment, it is not a reflection of your capacity to love, but of the alignment within that connection. Love, in its healthiest form, does not leave one person depleted while the other remains unaffected. It creates a rhythm where both individuals are sustained, heard, and valued in equal measure. When that rhythm is absent, the experience of love begins to shift from shared joy to quiet suffering. And suffering, when it becomes constant, is not something to normalize or reinterpret as strength. Strength is not measured by how long you can withstand imbalance, but by your willingness to recognize when something no longer aligns with your well-being. There is wisdom in acknowledging that not every relationship is meant to be preserved at all costs. Some are meant to teach, to shape, and to guide you toward a deeper understanding of what you need and what you deserve. To remain in a place where love feels like ongoing endurance is to slowly distance yourself from your own emotional truth. And yet, when you choose to see clearly, to accept the reality of imbalance without denying its presence, you reclaim a sense of inner authority. In that moment, you are no longer simply holding on. You are choosing with awareness, and that choice, grounded in honesty rather than fear, becomes the beginning of a different kind of peace, one where love is no longer something you endure, but something that gently sustains you in return. There comes a point in certain relationships where movement is no longer shared, where one life begins to stretch toward new understanding, new responsibility, and deeper awareness, while the other remains fixed in familiar patterns. At first, this difference may not feel significant. Love has a way of convincing us that connection alone is enough to bridge any gap, that time and closeness will naturally keep two paths aligned. But growth is not something that can be borrowed or transferred through proximity. It is something each person must choose and cultivate within themselves. When that choice is no longer made together, the distance between two people becomes less visible, yet more profound with every passing moment. In the early stages, there may have been a sense of shared direction, a feeling that both individuals were moving towards something meaningful together. Conversations were filled with plans, ideas, and aspirations that seemed to echo each other's intentions. But as time unfolds, circumstances change, priorities evolve, and inner transformations begin to shape new perspectives. One person may begin to seek clarity, purpose, or discipline in ways that require reflection and effort, while the other may remain anchored in comfort, repetition, or avoidance of change. Neither path is inherently wrong, but when those paths no longer align, the relationship begins to lose its natural rhythm. Stoic thought encourages us to recognize reality without clinging to what once was or resisting what has become. A relationship that once felt like forward movement can quietly become a place of emotional stillness when growth is no longer mutual. In such a state, the connection may continue out of habit, memory, or a reluctance to accept change, but beneath the surface, something essential is missing. There is no longer a shared sense of becoming, no collective progression that nourishes both individuals equally. Instead, one may feel held back, while the other may feel pressured or unchanged, creating an unspoken tension that neither fully addresses. Over time, this lack of shared evolution can lead to a subtle internal conflict. You may begin to notice that your thoughts, values, or ambitions no longer resonate within the relationship in the same way they once did. The conversations that once inspired you may now feel limited, and the experiences that once brought connection may begin to feel repetitive or unfulfilling. This is not always due to conflict or disagreement, but rather the quiet absence of forward movement together. And in that absence, the relationship may start to feel less like a partnership and more like a pause in your personal journey. Growth is not about becoming identical, but about moving in a direction where both individuals continue to expand, learn, and support one another's evolution. When that mutual progression is present, a relationship becomes a space of encouragement and shared purpose. But when it is absent, staying connected can unintentionally create stagnation, where both individuals remain in a cycle that no longer reflects who they are becoming. To recognize this is not an act of rejection, but an act of awareness. It requires honesty to admit that love alone does not guarantee alignment, and courage to accept that two people may reach a point where their journeys no longer unfold side by side. In that recognition lies a deeper respect for both yourself and the other person, understanding that growth, when no longer shared, may call for a different kind of decision, one that honors the direction each life is meant to take, even if those directions are no longer the same. Trust is not something that is built in grand gestures alone. It is constructed quietly through consistency, honesty, and the small decisions that either honor or weaken a bond. In the beginning, trust often feels natural, almost effortless, as if the connection itself carries an unspoken promise of reliability. There is a sense of safety in believing what is said, in relying on actions to match intentions, and in feeling that both individuals are equally committed to protecting what they share. But trust, once tested and broken, does not return to its original form simply through words or apologies. It requires time, accountability, and a genuine transformation in behavior that demonstrates a lasting change. When trust is broken repeatedly, it begins to lose its meaning within the relationship. Each instance may be explained, justified, or softened in the moment, yet the emotional impact accumulates quietly. You may find yourself questioning not only the other person's actions, but also your own judgment, wondering whether to believe, whether to wait, or whether to accept things as they are. This internal conflict creates a steady erosion of certainty, replacing it with doubt that lingers even in moments that should feel secure. Over time, the mind becomes cautious and the heart becomes guarded, not because love has disappeared, but because safety can no longer be assumed. Stoic wisdom teaches that clarity is essential, especially when emotions begin to cloud perception. Trust is not meant to be rebuilt through repeated cycles of breaking and repairing without real change. When promises are made but not upheld, when patterns repeat despite awareness, the foundation of the relationship becomes unstable. And no matter how strong the emotional attachment may be, a structure built on inconsistency cannot provide lasting stability. It may stand for a while, held together by hope or familiarity, but beneath that surface, the cracks continue to widen. In such situations, it is easy to hold on to the potential of what the relationship could become rather than acknowledging what it consistently shows itself to be. You may remember the moments when trust felt intact, when reassurance came easily, and when connection felt secure. But Stoicism invites us to remain grounded in the present reality, not in past experiences or future expectations. If trust continues to be compromised without meaningful change, then the relationship is no longer aligned with the principle of reliability that healthy connections require. Repeated broken trust also affects the way you engage with others and with yourself. It can lead to hesitation in expressing openness, difficulty in forming new connections, or a tendency to question sincerity even in unrelated situations. This ripple effect extends beyond the relationship itself, influencing your sense of emotional stability and inner confidence. Trust, once fractured, does not only impact the bond between two people, it reshapes the way you perceive safety and honesty in general. To acknowledge repeated broken trust is not an expression of bitterness, but an act of honesty. It requires the willingness to see patterns as they are, rather than as they are hoped to be. While forgiveness may be part of personal growth, trust must be earned through consistent and reliable actions over time. When that consistency is absent, the heart is faced with a difficult but necessary realization that remaining in a cycle of repeated disappointment does not restore trust, but rather delays the moment when clarity must guide the next step. There is a quiet kind of dissonance that begins to form when your values are no longer acknowledged, when what you stand for is met not with curiosity or respect, but with dismissal or indifference. At first, it may appear in small moments, an opinion overlooked, a boundary tested, a principle gently questioned as though it were negotiable. You may respond with patience, believing that understanding will come with time, that differences can be bridged through explanation or compromise. Yet over time, when those same moments repeat without change, something deeper begins to settle within you. A realization that your inner compass is no longer being treated as something meaningful within the relationship. Your values are not random preferences. They are the quiet architecture of your character. They shape the way you choose, the way you respond, the way you move through the world with intention and integrity. When these values are consistently ignored, it is not merely a difference of opinion. It becomes a pattern that gradually erodes the sense of being seen and respected for who you truly are. You may begin to question whether expressing your beliefs is worth the discomfort it brings, or whether remaining silent is the easier path to maintaining harmony. But silence, when chosen repeatedly at the cost of self-respect, slowly distances you from your own authenticity. In relationships where alignment exists, values are not identical in every detail, but they are honored. There is space for dialogue, for disagreement that does not diminish the worth of either person, and for boundaries that are understood rather than challenged. When that space is absent and your core principles are treated as obstacles rather than foundations, the relationship begins to feel less like a shared journey and more like a constant negotiation of your identity. Over time, this can lead to a subtle internal conflict where you are torn between maintaining connection and remaining true to yourself. Stoic thought encourages a life guided by principle rather than pressure. It asks us to remain anchored in what we know to be right for ourselves, even when external circumstances make that difficult. When your values are repeatedly dismissed, it becomes necessary to observe not only how the other person responds, but how the relationship as a whole responds to the essence of who you are. If your principles must be set aside in order to avoid tension, then the connection is no longer supporting your growth. It is asking you to compromise the very foundation upon which your sense of self is built. There is a quiet strength in recognizing when your values are no longer being honored. It does not require anger or confrontation to see clearly. It requires honesty. And with that honesty comes the understanding that a relationship cannot sustain depth if it consistently overlooks the core of who you are. To remain in such a space may feel familiar, even comforting at times, but familiarity should not be mistaken for alignment. A connection that does not respect your values will, over time, ask you to become someone you are not meant to be. Choosing to acknowledge this truth is not an act of distance, but an act of self-respect. It is the moment you stop asking yourself to adapt endlessly and instead begin to recognize that your values deserve a place where they are not questioned as a burden, but embraced as a defining part of your presence. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not arrive all at once, but builds quietly in the spaces where effort is no longer returned in equal measure. At first, you may not recognize it as imbalance. You may tell yourself that giving more is simply part of caring deeply, that love naturally calls for patience, understanding, and persistence. So you continue to show up, to listen, to support, to make adjustments where needed, believing that consistency on your part will eventually inspire the same in return. But over time, what begins as willingness can slowly turn into a pattern where your energy is continually extended outward while very little flows back toward you. In a balanced connection, effort is not something that must be measured constantly because it is shared naturally between two people who both value the relationship. There is a rhythm to it, an unspoken agreement that both individuals will contribute not only in moments of ease, but also in moments that require attention, care, and emotional presence. Conversations are mutual, planning is shared, and support is exchanged rather than requested repeatedly by only one side. But when that rhythm is absent, the relationship begins to feel like something that depends on your continuous input to remain intact. You may start to notice subtle shifts in your experience. Plans that you initiate become routine, while reciprocal gestures become rare. Efforts to communicate or resolve issues may go unanswered or only partially acknowledged. Over time, you begin to carry the responsibility of maintaining connection, filling silence, and bridging gaps that are not of your making. This creates an invisible weight, one that is not always seen by others, but is deeply felt within your own sense of emotional energy. Stoic thinking encourages awareness of where your efforts are directed and whether they align with a healthy and sustainable reality. Effort, when mutual, strengthens a relationship, but when it becomes one-sided, it often leads to quiet resentment. Not always expressed outwardly, this resentment can build internally as unspoken disappointment accumulates. You may not immediately confront it, but you begin to feel it in the form of fatigue, hesitation, or a gradual withdrawal of enthusiasm that once came naturally. There is also a moment of self-reflection that emerges in such situations. You may ask yourself whether giving more will eventually change the dynamic, or whether stepping back will cause the connection to weaken further. In that uncertainty, it becomes important to observe the pattern rather than the promise. A relationship that consistently requires one person to carry its emotional weight is not in balance, regardless of intentions or past experiences. Effort alone cannot compensate for the absence of reciprocity. To recognize one-sided effort is not to judge the other person harshly, but to understand the nature of the connection as it currently exists. It is an acknowledgement that relationships are meant to be shared spaces where presence, care, and commitment are exchanged rather than extracted from one side alone. When that exchange is no longer present, continuing to give without reflection may slowly lead you away from your own sense of equilibrium. In that awareness, there is clarity. And within that clarity lies the understanding that your time, your energy, and your emotional investment deserve to exist in a space where they are met with equal intention, not continually extended into a void that does not respond in kind. There is a subtle unraveling that can occur when a relationship begins to ask you, not directly but persistently, to step away from who you are at your core. It does not always happen through force or clear demand. Often, it begins with quiet adjustments, small compromises that seem reasonable in isolation. You may change how you speak to avoid disagreement, soften your opinions to maintain peace, or set aside certain interests and habits because they are not fully accepted or understood. Individually, each change may appear harmless, even necessary for harmony, but collectively, they can slowly reshape the way you show up in your own life. Identity is not something rigid or fixed. It evolves over time through experience, reflection, and growth. However, there is a difference between evolving naturally and gradually drifting away from your authentic self in order to fit into a dynamic that does not fully accommodate who you are. When a relationship begins to require consistent self-suppression, you may notice that your decisions are no longer guided by your inner voice, but by anticipation of reaction. You begin to measure not what feels true, but what will be accepted, tolerated, or avoided. In this process, boundaries often become blurred. You may not consciously abandon them at first, but over time, repeated concessions can weaken your ability to uphold them with clarity. What once felt like a firm sense of self begins to feel adaptable to the point of uncertainty. You might catch yourself agreeing when you would normally question, staying silent when you would usually speak, or participating in situations that no longer align with your values or preferences. These shifts can accumulate quietly, creating a version of yourself that is increasingly shaped by external expectations rather than internal conviction. Stoic reflection invites awareness of this gradual transformation. It encourages you to observe whether your environment supports the maintenance of your character or subtly pulls you away from it. A healthy relationship does not require you to abandon your identity. Instead, it allows space for it to exist fully, even when differences arise. There is room for individuality without pressure to conform, and room for expression without fear of dismissal. When that space is missing, maintaining the relationship can come at the cost of diminishing your own sense of self. Over time, the emotional impact of losing touch with your identity may present itself as a quiet dissatisfaction, a feeling that something essential is missing even in moments that appear stable on the surface. You may not immediately connect this feeling to the changes you have made, but internally, there is often a recognition that you are no longer living or expressing yourself in the way that feels most genuine. This realization does not arrive abruptly. It builds gradually as the distance between who you are and how you are living becomes more noticeable. To recognize this pattern is to return to a deeper awareness of your own boundaries and values. It is not about rejecting connection, but about acknowledging whether the connection allows you to remain whole. A relationship should not require the abandonment of your identity in order to continue. It should exist in a way that supports and respects it. When that is no longer the case, the question is not only about the relationship itself, but about the importance of preserving the essence of who you are, even in the presence of someone else. There is a quiet shift that takes place when a relationship begins to hold more tension than tenderness, more conflict than calm, and more criticism than care. At first, the negative moments may feel occasional, scattered between periods that still carry warmth and connection. You may focus on those lighter moments, holding on to them as evidence that things are still good, still worth preserving. Yet over time, if the balance continues to tilt, the emotional atmosphere of the relationship begins to change. What once felt like a place of comfort slowly becomes a place where you brace yourself, where interactions are approached with caution rather than ease. Persistent negativity does not always arrive in obvious forms. It can appear in repeated misunderstandings that are never fully resolved, in conversations that end with frustration instead of clarity, or in subtle patterns of criticism that gradually chip away at confidence. Words that may seem small in isolation can accumulate, shaping the way you feel within the relationship. Instead of feeling uplifted or supported, you may begin to feel drained after interactions, as though each exchange requires more emotional effort than it returns. Over time, this imbalance becomes difficult to ignore, even if it is not openly acknowledged. In a relationship where positivity is present, challenges are met with cooperation, and differences are approached with respect. There is room for disagreement without hostility, and space for resolution without lingering resentment. Positive moments are not rare exceptions, but natural elements of the connection. However, when negativity becomes the dominant pattern, those positive moments begin to feel temporary, almost fragile, as though they cannot fully counter the weight of what surrounds them. This creates a dynamic where joy is no longer consistent, but instead appears briefly between cycles of tension. Stoic reflection encourages a clear observation of patterns rather than isolated moments. It is easy to focus on the times when things feel good and overlook the recurring experiences that shape the overall reality of the relationship. But when negativity outweighs positivity over time, it becomes important to recognize the direction in which the connection is moving. A relationship that consistently produces stress, frustration, or emotional discomfort does not align with the principles of balance and well-being that sustain healthy bonds. This does not mean that conflict itself is a sign of failure. Disagreements are a natural part of any relationship where two individuals bring their own perspectives and experiences. What matters is how those disagreements are handled, and whether they lead to understanding or repeated cycles of harm. When negativity becomes a pattern rather than an exception, it signals that something fundamental in the dynamic is not being addressed or resolved. There is also an internal effect that develops when positivity is consistently overshadowed. Over time, your emotional state may begin to reflect the environment you are in. You might notice a decline in enthusiasm, a reduction in openness, or a growing sense of heaviness associated with the relationship. These feelings are not random. They are responses to an environment that no longer provides the balance needed to sustain emotional well-being. To acknowledge persistent negativity is to face the reality of the relationship as it exists, not as it occasionally appears during its better moments. It is an understanding that consistency matters more than exceptions, and that a healthy connection should not require you to endure ongoing emotional strain in order to preserve moments of temporary relief. There is a moment in every difficult relationship where the heart already knows the truth, yet the mind continues to negotiate with it. We search for reasons to stay, explanations to soften what we feel, and possibilities that allow us to delay a decision we are not yet ready to face. In that space, denial often appears gentle, even protective. It convinces us that with more time, more patience, or more effort, things will return to what they once were. But reality has its own quiet way of revealing itself, not in a single revelation, but through consistent patterns that ask to be acknowledged rather than avoided. Acceptance does not arrive as a sudden release of emotion, nor does it require the absence of care. It is a gradual alignment between what we feel and what we are willing to see. When a relationship no longer reflects balance, respect, growth, trust, or shared effort, acceptance invites us to stop reshaping the truth into something more comfortable. It asks us to observe without distortion, to understand without justification, and to recognize when holding on is no longer preserving the relationship, but prolonging the internal conflict within ourselves.